All right. So I mentioned why 1763 is an important date, and still, again, the reason is because it marks the beginning of colonial crisis, but it also marks the end of the Seven Years' War. So this is what we're going to discuss here: the role of the Seven Years' War, otherwise known as the French Indian War, when you look at American textbooks. But how this war played a role in the developing colonial crisis, how it contributed to tension and eventual antagonism between the colonials in North America and the mother country of England. So, we're not going to really delve into military history here. Um, but I do want to make some prefatory remarks before we discuss the specific legacies of the Seven Years' War and how it contributed towards that colonial tension leading to revolution. Um, this war actually started in North America, in the New World, between the English colonials in the 13 colonies, right? And the French colonials more towards the Midwest, because that's where New France, as they called it, right? The North American colonies owned by France. Um, this is where the French presence was. Parts of, let's say, Canada going towards the Great Lakes region and stretching down the Mississippi River and all the way down to New Orleans, actually. If you know anything about New Orleans, you know there's a heavy French influence there today. In any case, what you have happening here is, not surprisingly, English expansionism going westward. And this is not simply the sort of exploration of uncharted territory to find out what was there, right? Or not simply just to gain land if you're, let's say, a person who aspired to gain land in the West, but it also involves commercial expansion. Um, in fact, the conflict happened or erupted because the Ohio Company, and again, keyword company there, right? Basically ran into or collided with the French settlers already there because the Ohio Company is trying to expand even more west, but they're bound to collide with the French at one point. And this is when it happened, and it led to the Seven Years' War. And interestingly enough, when hostilities escalated, you had a young general named George Washington bring over a contingent of colonial troops over there, and he lost. He lost that battle, and of course, he'd become a great general during the American Revolutionary War a few years later. But this is what sparked this war, and it's important to note this that. As you see here on this slide, historians acknowledge the Seven Years' War as the first world war in history. And by the way, that's why I didn't prefer to call it the French Indian War, because that's very specific to what I said earlier, American history. It only suggests, North American conflict. But look at this map in terms of where the conflict was happening, right? It spans the globe, many areas of the globe. And why is that? If you really ponder that question, why is this the first world war in history? And you think about what we've discussing ever since, the age of European imperialism, ever since 1492, with this small corner right here, right, Europe expanding all over the world to gain colonies, right, ever since 1492 again. Well, it now makes sense why this will become a world war by 1763, because with all the territories being seized and possessed by these European empires through imperialism, whenever they're going to see each other overseas, right, they're going to fight. Whenever you see rival Europeans in a state of war, they're going to fight. So that means you may see English versus French here, right? Oh, by the way, I should mention that even though it's primarily England versus France, those two empires, what happens here is an alliance system whereby England had her allies, France had her allies, and if they went to war, that means the allies were expected to fight. Okay, so in this case, if you look here in the Philippines itself, right, this is a far stretch from a conflict that happened here. Why are they fighting here? Well, the Philippines was a colony of Spain. And Spain, by the Seven Years' War, was an ally of France. So therefore, England is going to fight Spain over here. And actually, for a year or two, because the English won some battles, and because really the wars were victorious for the English at the end, right? The end of the Seven Years' War, they gained the Philippines for a few years, and then they actually returned it back to Spain. But nonetheless, you see conflict erupting here in what we call South Asia. Certainly, Russia, right? Russia encompasses two continents here, right? I believe there's like 7 time zones in Russia alone. Even in Africa, on both sides of the coast, you see conflict again because these are colonial possessions of specific European empires, right? The settlement might be small, like these little dots here, or they might be growing in size here, but nonetheless, there's conflicts erupting. And of course, in the New World, that's where the majority of the conflict is happening, especially in North America. Okay, by the way, if you've seen the movie Last of the Mohicans with the actor Daniel Day Lewis, it's a really good movie. You should check it out. But it's basically a depiction of the 7 Years' War happening, here in the Great Lakes region, where most of the conflict was indeed happening, as I previously stated. Okay, so it's the first World War in history, and again, you have to make that connection to European overseas imperialism, which we've been discussing, right? This is called the age of European imperialism. And we've seen how that figures prominently in not only colonization, right, and glory and God and wealth, right, the acquisition of wealth, but also even economic theory, like we talked about mercantilism, right? We acknowledge that mercantilism as an economic theory and practice emerged during the age of imperialism, with the reality or the specificity of these European empires always at war with each other. Okay, so I just stated that the war was won by the English and her allies. And according to the Treaty of Paris, and let me move to the next slide here. According to the Treaty of Paris, and now we could start talking about number one. Okay, and here again, let me remind you, we're talking about how the legacies, or at least these specific legacies, are going to influence colonial tension between the English colonials and the mother country of England. Now, I previously stated there, excuse me, that the colonials during the war never felt more British. Right, the historian who I was paraphrasing basically said in 1763 the colonials never felt more British, and the reason why again was because they're fighting side by side with the mother country of England. They're fighting alongside the British troops, who were the most, probably the best army at that time. Certainly, the Navy was the best at that time, and they won the war. So, if you're a member of the English Empire, you're very proud. Again, the central place of glory, right? You feel like you're part of this glorious empire called the English Empire that just defeated their perennial enemy, the French Empire, in this long and deadly war. Okay, so at the same time, however, interestingly enough, they began to experience, or let me rephrase that, it's the beginning of colonial tension. They begin to experience this antagonism, right, against the English presence in the New World. Okay, so now I was saying that the Treaty of Paris had certain conditions put forth towards um, the French specifically. And one of those conditions, probably the most, you know, the most glaring, if you will, condition that affected the French Empire as a whole, was that France must turn over her possessions in North America and pretty much almost all of the New World to the English and her allies. Okay, so what does that mean? It means after about 200 years of exploration and settlement and trade happening within North America or in the New World in general, France had to basically leave the New World. They're kicked out. Now, they didn't lose all their possessions. Some of the islands, for example, in the Caribbean, were retained. But certainly in North America, you see them relinquishing, forfeiting all their colonial possessions to the English. Now, this is what we mean by the legacy of redrawing the colonial map of North America. So, from the English perspective, what happens is your empire doubles in size, right? Nearly. Um, the extent of British territory, especially in North America, has almost overnight, right? After the Treaty of Paris ended the war, doubled in size, right? And this is an enormous gain, needless to say, for the English Empire in North America, right? Now they have territory stretching beyond the Appalachians, right, where they were kind of confined before the war, right? I mentioned the Ohio Valley region, right? Now they have all that land to the west of them until, let's say, Mississippi River and even beyond at certain parts. Okay, so how does this contribute to growing tension? Well, in a few ways. Let me say one way, and I'm going to connect it to another legacy here. One way that it contributed to tensions is that in the case of number one, with the gaining of all this massive territory, the English Empire now faced a pressing economic matter, and that's consolidating all their possessions in North America. They needed to consolidate their territory in North America, but that's going to cost money. Okay, and they need to get to it right away, right? But here's the thing, and let me connect it with number four down here. Because of the global scope of the war, because of the protracted, that is to say, 7 years, right? Protracted length of the war, England was now broke. Okay, they were bankrupt. Their imperial coffers, so to say, ran dry. So therefore, you needed to find an immediate source of replenishment to solve this sort of economic, condition of insolvency. So if you relate to number one, right, um, you needed to consolidate empire because it's more than doubling in size, but that costs money. But when you think about number four, one legacy of the 7 Years' War was exactly the state of bankruptcy. How could you take care of number one when you're broke in the years after the war? Well, obviously, well, we know the answer, right? As in any government, whether today in 2020, the 21st century, or back then, well, you have to tax. You have to tax your citizens, or in this case, tax your subjects, right? The subjects of the English Empire. And this is exactly what happens immediately. And you know how that's going to contribute to attention, hopefully, right? Um, Going back to, week 2 or 3, we mentioned that the North American colonies, even the earliest ones, we talked about three variants, right? Pennsylvania and Maryland as the experimental colonies, but we also talked about the Chesapeake region and Puritan New England. Ever since then, the various earliest settlements, we noticed that England tended to be hands off, so to say, in their relationship, in their intervention with their colonies abroad. So, because of that, this applied also to taxation. Now, of course, there were taxes, but most of them, as implemented from, let's say, Parliament, taxation legislation, most of it was what we call sales tax today, right? Let's remember that by the 18th century, the English colonials were avid consumers of English finished goods and even luxury items, right? Of course, there's going to be a duty on that, a tax, right? But was it a direct tax? Is a sales tax a direct tax? Like it is today, we have income tax or what have you, a direct tax. No, it's not. Okay, it's associated with sales, right? With economics, but it's not associated with a direct tax, right? So this is exactly what's going to happen. Parliament is going to impose direct taxes upon the colonials. All right. Now, this is important to note here. The North American colonials, the English colonials in North America, were the most undertaxed population. They were the least taxed population of the entire English Empire. Okay, even the Irish colonials in Ireland were taxed significantly more than the English in the colonies, west across the Atlantic, right? And you put that together with the fact that they've been basically left alone by Parliament. Again, let's recall salutary neglect, right? A policy that basically dictated that pattern through the decades. Okay, so because of that, you could kind of see why the colonials are going to react in a defiant manner, really. Okay, because they felt that this new taxation was unjust, unfair. They will call it illegal. And pretty soon we're going to talk about no taxation without representation, quote unquote. Okay, but now you can see how number four is hopefully related to number one, even, right? You need to consolidate the map or the colonial possession, excuse me, but also you don't have any money. Well, we got to tax everyone, and that includes now the English subjects in the New World. Okay, and also number one relates to number three. Okay, so with the Treaty of Paris, and you have them, the French that is, giving all their territory to the English. If you're Indians, Native Americans in this region in North America, right, in the regions that used to be possessed by Spain, that is, how did you feel about this? Okay, well, you could almost guess because, as I mentioned a while back, and this is just a reminder if you forgot, the Indians tended, or excuse me, the French tended to treat the Indians as equals, definitely much more than the English did. The English tended to relegate all inhabitants as being sort of savages, right? And with the French, they treated them with more or less equality. Let's even remember the case of the Middle Ground, where they forged this unique emergent culture in society, that was based on both cultures. And why could that happen? Because the French treated them as equals, right? So, with the French now cast out, the English are now forced to deal with only one European empire in North America, and that's the English, which they didn't like. Now, just a little explanation here. Okay, in terms of the role of Indians. Well, during the war itself, the 7 Years' War, you see Indians on both sides in North America. In fact, if you watch that movie that I mentioned, you'll see Indians on both sides. The Indians played the central role in that movie. That's why it's an interesting movie, the Last of the Mohicans. But you see Indians on the side of the English as well as the French. Well, as historians have noted, the native inhabitants who sided with the English tended to do so because they were in war with other, Indian tribes, right? They had their perennial enemies who were Indian tribes. And if those Indian tribes tended to side with France, then they would automatically go on the side of the English because, they were at war with those tribes that held allegiance to France. Okay, so that explains more or less why you have Indians on both sides. Okay, but now again, the Indians after the war, with the French kicked out, they did not trust the English. In fact, right away you see a conflict happening called Pontiac's Rebellion. And Pontiac's Rebellion was led by the leader Pontiac, who appealed to what we call today something called Pan-Indianism. Okay, and basically, Pan-Indianism is this. Here's Pontiac saying, "Hey, listen, all you tribes, I know some of us are enemies, but you know what? We better acknowledge the fact that we're all Indians." Okay, and that's interesting because it's in a way they're accepting that imposition of that racial category that the English and even the French, right, created, and they posed upon the Indians, right, as a way to categorize Indians. Of course, if you're an Indian, you never consider yourself Indians. You never considered, all tribes as one race, right? That's like saying if you go to Europe, English and Irish and Italians are all one race, right? When culturally, linguistically, that's it's hard to say that, right? Hard to make sense of that. Okay, so similar with Indians, you had Pontiac actually, in a way, forced to accept that racial category, appeal to them as all Indians, quote unquote, and to form this alliance against the imminent intrusion of the English on their land. They knew it was coming, the encroachment of the English. So you have Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War that happens in 1763. Now, the last thing, by the way, that the English really wanted was more warfare. Because after all, they're exhausted from the 7 Years' War. Now they have to fight, Indians in North America. So what they did is pass something called the Proclamation of 1763. And that's Parliament issuing this decree saying that colonials cannot move west in the territory newly gained from France. It's an order, basically. Okay, it's a decree. Now, again, imagine this. If you're a colonial, how do you receive that? Well, again, since Parliament has never been there to enforce authority, right? For the most part, again, you know, uh, you resent that if you're colonial. Why? Because all this land exists there. Let's say you're a pioneer on the fringe of frontier, and the war ends, and there's all this land you could gain. You want to move into that land. You want to get what you could get and claim it as yours. But now here's Parliament all of a sudden asserting its authority. And again, this is something new that they're doing because of salutary neglect, the tradition of that, where they didn't do that before. So that's going to, again, arouse the ire of the colonials. So you can see how that leads to tension. Okay? So, 1, 3, and 4 are all related on how tension unfolds, right? Even though it might not be apparent just by reading it, on the surface. But number 2 is interesting because it highlights how tension was even unfolding before the end of the war. That's to say, during the war. Okay? I said that the colonials are fighting side by side with the English troops, but even then, English troops tended to treat colonials in general, all the colonials, in a condescending manner. They considered them as, well, we would use phrases today like, redneck or, you hick or something, country bumpkin, as if they're almost less civilized in a way. You could almost make that claim, right? Or when you use that term, redneck, right? So it was this condescending attitude they held, and the colonials began to resent that greatly. At the same time, this was a major source of friction. The fact that the the Parliament demanded that the colonials house British troops in North America. Why? Because this is a different war. Before the Seven Years' War, if you went to war with another English empire, excuse me, with another European empire, you went to war in one continent only, pretty much, right? The European continent. But now it's a world war. It's happening in the North America in this case. You have no way to house them as what existed before. There was no pre-existing infrastructure to house and provide supply and munitions and all that, as was the case before the Seven Years' War. So they had to improvise, and they basically mandated that colonials provide shelter, lodging, and even supplies and even food. So even though you're a colonial fighting alongside the English, you resent this. And guess what's in our Constitution, in our Bill of Rights, right? Number 3 is no quartering of troops. So you could see how controversial this was, how it was perceived as a violation of freedom. And therefore, it has a place in our Bill of Rights, right? That's how glaring of an issue it was back then. Okay, and let me name one more thing that was happening that caused the English to really resent the colonials. And that's the activity of colonial trade with France, even during the war. They earlier, before the war, they tried to regulate the colonials. They passed what's called the Navigation Acts. There's a series of them, basically trying to say, in the mercantilist spirit, hey, trade only with the English. Don't trade with the French or Spanish or what have you in the New World. But pretty much the colonials did not pay attention to the Navigation Acts. They smuggled stuff in, right? So guess what happens during the Seven Years' War? The colonials still like certain French products, right? Especially their rum. And one day they're fighting the French, and the next day undercover, they're trading with them. And of course, the English got word of this, and they couldn't believe it, and they chastised the colonials for this, right? So there you go, growing mistrust. So you put 1 through 4 together, and then you see the implementation of taxation, which we'll talk about next. This is what's going to basically grease the wheels, if you will, in the movement towards July 4th, 1776. Okay, we'll move to a next video.